There are moments in history when everything changes. When the world you have known, the rhythms that have sustained your people for generations, suddenly fracture. But before we witness that fracturing, we must understand what was about to be lost. We must step into Jerusalem, as it was in the final years of the 7th century before the Common Era, when a young man named Daniel walked its streets, breathed its air, and absorbed a way of life that would soon exist only in memory. Picture, if you will, the city at dawn. The first light touches the limestone walls, turning them golden. From every quarter of Jerusalem, the sound rises, the bleating of lambs being led toward the Temple Mount, the rhythmic grinding of grain between stones, the calls of merchants already arranging their wares in the marketplace. This is not merely a city waking. This is a people remembering who they are. The temple dominates everything. Stand anywhere in Jerusalem, and your eyes are drawn upward to that magnificent structure, its courtyards already filling with worshippers. The smoke of the morning sacrifice spirals skyward, carrying with it the prayers of thousands. This is no ordinary building. It is the axis around which the entire cosmos turns, at least for the people who call this place home. Here, they believe, heaven touches earth. Here, the God who spoke the universe into existence has chosen to place his name. Consider for a moment what this means. In a world populated by countless deities, each tied to a place, a people, or a natural force, the God of Israel claims something different. He is not one among many. He is the creator of all, yet he has bound himself by covenant to one small nation, promised them this land, and commanded them to live in a way that sets them apart from every other people on earth. Young Daniel would have learned this from his earliest days. Born into a noble family, perhaps even connected to the royal household, he grew up in privilege. But privilege in Judah came with profound responsibility. The families of position were guardians of something more valuable than wealth. They were keepers of memory, preservers of the law, teachers of the covenant that defined their existence. His education would have begun early, as it did for all children of his class, not in buildings we would recognize as schools, but in the intimate settings of home and synagogue. The words of the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, were not merely studied. They were memorized, chanted, woven into the fabric of daily life until a boy could recite passages as naturally as he could breathe. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These were not abstract concepts. They were commands that shaped every hour of every day. The rhythm of life in Jerusalem pulsed with sacred time. Every 7th day brought the Sabbath, when all work ceased. Imagine a city falling silent. No fires kindled, no commerce conducted, no journeys undertaken beyond a Sabbath day's walk. In a world that never stopped, that ground forward relentlessly, the people of Judah stopped. They rested. They remembered that they had once been slaves in Egypt, and the God who freed them had given them this gift of rest. The Sabbath was not merely a day off. It was resistance against the tyranny of endless productivity, a weekly declaration that humans are more than the sum of their labor. And then there were the festivals. 3 times each year the roads to Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims. At Passover, families gathered to remember the night of deliverance, when the angel of death passed over the houses marked with lamb's blood. They ate unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and retold the story of the Exodus as if they themselves had walked out of Egypt. Memory became present reality. Past deliverance gave hope for future redemption. 50 days after Passover came the Eva, Festival of Weeks, celebrating the wheat harvest and commemorating the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. The temple courts overflowed with offerings of grain and first fruits. Then, in autumn, came the Festival of Tabernacles, when families built temporary shelters and lived in them for 7 days, remembering the wilderness wandering, those 40 years when their ancestors dwelt in tents and learned to depend entirely on God's provision. These were not quaint customs. They were identity markers, boundary lines that separated Israel from the nations around them. They were memory made tangible, theology transformed into practice, covenant relationship expressed through feast and fast. The dietary laws reinforced this distinctiveness at every meal. Certain animals were clean, others unclean. Meat and dairy could not mix. Blood was forbidden, for the life was in the blood. To a neighboring Canaanite or Philistine, these restrictions might seem arbitrary, even burdensome. But to a Jewish family, they were daily reminders of holiness, of being set apart. Every meal became an act of worship, every choice of food a reaffirmation of covenant. Daniel would have known these laws intimately. In his mother's kitchen, he would have watched the careful preparation of food according to kashrut. He would have understood that to eat was to participate in something larger than satisfying hunger. It was to acknowledge the source of all life, to practice gratitude, to maintain the boundaries that preserved Israel's unique calling. The social fabric of Judean society was complex, layered with meaning and responsibility. At the top stood the king, the anointed one, the descendant of David who bore the weight of God's promises for an eternal throne. Below him, the priests and Levites, born into their roles, responsible for the temple rituals that maintained the relationship between God and people. Then came the prophets, those often uncomfortable voices who claimed to speak God's word, directly, holding kings and priests accountable to the covenant. But most of the population were farmers and artisans, shepherds and merchants, people whose days revolved around the practical demands of survival in a land that could be harsh. They planted their barley and wheat, tended their olive groves, pressed their wine, and raised their sheep. Yet even their agricultural calendar was sanctified. The land itself was to rest every 7th year. The corners of fields were to be left unharvested for the poor. The first of every crop belonged to God. This was the world that shaped Daniel, a world where the sacred and the ordinary intertwined so thoroughly that they could not be separated. A world where identity was not individual but corporate, where belonging meant sharing a story that stretched back centuries, where the past was never past because it lived in every ritual, every prayer, every meal. But in the year 609 before the Common Era, everything began to unravel. King Josiah, who had led the greatest religious reform in Judah's recent history, who had purged the land of foreign altars and rededicated the people to the covenant, made a fatal mistake. He marched his army north to intercept Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at Megiddo, trying to prevent Egyptian forces from reinforcing Assyria against the rising power of Babylon. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Josiah died on the battlefield, his body was brought back to Jerusalem, and the nation mourned as they had not mourned in generations. With Josiah died the hope of sustained reform, the dream of renewed covenant faithfulness, the possibility that perhaps this generation might avoid the judgment the prophets had been warning about for decades. The political situation deteriorated rapidly. Judah found itself trapped between empires. To the south, Egypt sought to maintain its influence. To the north and east, Babylon was ascending, crushing all resistance. Judah's kings, one after another, made disastrous choices. They rebelled against Babylon, trusted in Egyptian promises of support, ignored the prophets who counseled submission. The prophet Jeremiah walked the streets of Jerusalem, wearing a yoke around his neck to symbolize the coming subjugation, pleading with the people to accept Babylon's dominance as God's judgment. Submit, he urged, and live. Rebel and face destruction. Few listened. Submission seemed like cowardice, acceptance like faithlessness. Surely God would not allow his temple to be destroyed, his city to fall, his people to be dragged into exile. But in 605 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar, the crown prince of Babylon, defeated Egypt at Carchemish. The balance of power shifted decisively. Within months, Babylonian armies stood before Jerusalem's gates. King Jehoiakim, who had been Egypt's puppet, suddenly became Babylon's vassal. As tribute, as insurance, as a calculated policy of control, Nebuchadnezzar demanded hostages. Not ordinary hostages. He wanted the best and brightest of Judah's nobility. Young men of royal or noble birth, physically perfect, intellectually gifted, educated in literature and learning, qualified to serve in the Babylonian court. These were not prisoners of war. They were investments. Nebuchadnezzar understood that the best way to control a vassal nation was to reshape its elite, to take the next generation of leaders and remake them into servants of Babylon. Among those selected was Daniel. We do not know his exact age, but he was likely in his middle to late teens, old enough to have completed his basic education in the Torah, young enough to be molded. He had been raised to lead in Jerusalem, to serve in the temple, perhaps to advise kings. Instead, he would be taken to Babylon, the greatest city on earth, the capital of an empire that seemed unstoppable. Try to imagine what this meant. Everything that gave his life meaning was rooted in Jerusalem, the temple where God's presence dwelt, the rituals that marked time as sacred, the dietary laws practiced at every meal, the Sabbath rest that structured each week, the community of covenant that shared his identity, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All of it was about to be torn away, yet in this moment of supreme loss, something remarkable happened. The young men taken to Babylon did not simply surrender their identity. They did not abandon their faith for convenience or survival. Instead, they discovered that what they carried inside themselves, the memorized Torah, the practiced prayers, the internalized values, could not be taken by any conqueror. The temple could be left behind, but the God of the temple could not be escaped. He was not bound to one place. He was with his people, even in exile. As Daniel prepared for the journey to Babylon, as he said goodbye to his family, as he took perhaps one last look at the Temple Mount where smoke still rose from the morning sacrifice, he could not have known what lay ahead. He could not have imagined that he would serve emperors for more than 6 decades, survive regime changes and palace intrigues, interpret dreams and read mysterious writing, be thrown into a den of lions and emerge unharmed. He could not have foreseen that his life would become a template for how to live faithfully in a foreign land, or that his visions would shape Jewish and Christian understanding of history's ultimate destination for millennia. All he knew was that the world he had known was ending. The journey ahead would test everything he believed about God, identity, and faithfulness. And in that testing, he would discover that some things cannot be taken by conquest, some truths cannot be changed by deportation, and some commitments run deeper than the threat of death. The caravan to Babylon was forming. Young Daniel, son of Judah, keeper of the covenant, was about to enter a world stranger and more magnificent than anything he could imagine. But he would not enter it alone, and he would not enter it empty. He carried with him something that Nebuchadnezzar's armies could never capture, or his wise men ever truly understand: the unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the only true God, and that faithfulness to him mattered more than life itself. The world that was Jerusalem would fall, the temple would burn, the people would be scattered, but the faith that Jerusalem represented, the covenant that defined its people, the God who had chosen them, these would endure. And a young man named Daniel would show how. The journey to Babylon took weeks. Imagine walking away from everything you have ever known, every step carrying you further from the life you expected to live. For Daniel and his companions, this was not simply a change of location. It was a crossing from one universe into another, from the known into the utterly alien. The young men travelled in chains, or perhaps more accurately, in the custody of Babylonian officials who treated them as valuable cargo. They were not common captives destined for hard labour. They were prizes, potential servants for the imperial court. But privilege does not erase trauma. As Jerusalem disappeared behind them, as the hills of Judah gave way to unfamiliar terrain, each step was a small death. Consider what they were leaving behind. Not just family and friends, though that loss was profound. They were leaving the land itself, the soil that God had promised to their ancestor Abraham nearly 2,000 years earlier. In ancient Near Eastern thinking, gods were territorial. They belonged to specific places, held power within defined boundaries. To leave your land was, in a sense, to leave your God's protection. What power could the God of Israel have in Babylon, the domain of Marduk, and 1,000 other deities? This question whether God's sovereignty extended beyond the Promised Land was not academic. It struck at the heart of everything the exiles believed. If God was only the God of Israel, in the geographical sense, then deportation was spiritual abandonment. But if he was truly the creator of heaven and earth, if his power transcended borders and kingdoms, then somehow, impossibly, he was with them even in Babylon. The first sight of Babylon must have been staggering. After weeks of travel through the Mesopotamian plain, the city appeared on the horizon like a vision from another world. This was not Jerusalem, with its sacred intimacy and ancient stones. This was the greatest metropolis on earth, home to perhaps 200,000 people, protected by walls so massive that chariots could race along their tops. The Ishtar Gate rose before them, covered in glazed blue bricks decorated with golden lions and mythical creatures. The processional way led through the gate, its walls lined with reliefs of dragons and bulls, symbols of Marduk and other Babylonian gods. The message was clear. You are entering a realm of power beyond anything you have known. Your God, your temple, your small kingdom, they are nothing compared to the glory of Babylon. And in many ways, the message appeared to be true. Babylon was magnificent beyond comprehension. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, cascaded with vegetation, an engineering marvel that seemed to defy nature itself. The ziggurat of Etemenanke, the temple tower dedicated to Marduk, dominated the skyline, rising nearly 300 feet into the air, a deliberate challenge to heaven, an assertion that human achievement could bridge the gap between earth and the divine. The streets teemed with life from every corner of the empire. Merchants from India, diplomats from Egypt, scholars speaking a dozen languages, priests conducting rituals to gods whose names the Jewish captives had never heard. At night, astrologers climbed to rooftops and towers to study the stars, believing they could read the future in celestial movements. Magic and divination permeated every level of society. The rational and the mystical blended seamlessly in Babylonian thought. For young men raised in strict monotheism, this was overwhelming. Jerusalem had certainly contained its share of idolatry. The prophets had been condemning it for generations. But Jerusalem's polytheism had always been seen as corruption, a betrayal of what should be. In Babylon, polytheism was not corruption. It was the natural order, the obvious truth, the sophisticated worldview of the most advanced civilization on earth. The psychological impact of this cultural shock cannot be overstated. These young men had grown up believing they were part of a chosen people, set apart by the one true God. Now they stood in a city that proclaimed, through every monument and ritual, that their beliefs were provincial, their God merely one among many, their confident monotheism, the naive conviction of an unsophisticated backwater. The trauma deepened when they were brought into the imperial program of re-education. This was not imprisonment. It was something far more insidious, an attempt at transformation. Nebuchadnezzar did not want to destroy these young men. He wanted to remake them into loyal servants of Babylon, to take the best minds of Judah and turn them into instruments of the empire that had conquered them. The process began with the most fundamental assault on identity, the changing of names. In Hebrew culture, names were not mere labels. They were prophetic declarations, statements of character and destiny, often invoking the name of God himself. Daniel's name meant, "God is my judge." It was a confession of faith, a reminder that ultimate accountability belonged to the Lord alone. The Babylonian officials renamed him Belteshazzar, meaning Bel protect his life, or Bel's prince. Bel was another name for Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. With one administrative act, Daniel's identity was symbolically erased and replaced. He was to become a servant of Marduk, his very name a prayer to a foreign deity. His three companions suffered similar transformations. Hananiah, "The Lord is gracious," became Shadrach, probably invoking the Babylonian moon god. Mishael, "Who is like God," became Meshach, perhaps meaning "who is like Aku," another Babylonian deity. Azariah, "The Lord helps," became Abednego, servant of Nebo, the god of wisdom and writing. The message was clear: you will forget the God of your fathers. You will worship our gods. You will become Babylonian in thought, speech, and devotion. Your old identity will fade like morning mist. You will be recreated in the image of the empire. But names, as it turns out, are not so easily changed when identity runs deeper than words. The young men accepted their new names. They had no choice, but something in them refused the transformation the names were meant to represent. The question was how to resist without inviting destruction, how to maintain faithfulness without committing suicide through defiance. Their education in Babylonian wisdom began immediately. For 3 years, they would study the language and literature of the Chaldeans, learning Akkadian, mastering cuneiform script, absorbing the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization. This was not brainwashing in the crude sense. It was something more sophisticated, an immersion in a worldview so comprehensive, so apparently successful, that it would naturally displace their earlier beliefs. They studied mathematics and astronomy, disciplines in which the Babylonians excelled. They learned the elaborate systems of divination, the interpretation of omens, the reading of animal entrails and celestial movements to predict the future. They absorbed the epic literature of Babylon, the Enuma Elish creation story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the myths of gods and heroes that explained how the world came to be and how humans should live within it. This presented a profound challenge. How could they learn this material without accepting its underlying assumptions? How could they master Babylonian wisdom without betraying the wisdom of the Torah? It would have been easy to simply reject everything, to refuse engagement, to maintain purity through isolation. But that path led nowhere. They would fail the program, lose their positions, perhaps their lives. Instead, they chose something far more difficult. They would learn everything the Babylonians could teach them, would master the empire's intellectual traditions, but would evaluate everything through the lens of their own faith. They would become bilingual not just in language but in worldview, capable of moving between Babylonian and Jewish frames of reference while maintaining their core commitments. This strategy required extraordinary mental discipline. It meant holding 2 systems of thought simultaneously, understanding how Babylonians saw the world while never forgetting how God had revealed himself to Israel. It meant appearing to assimilate while maintaining inner distinctiveness. It was a tightrope walk across an abyss, and one misstep could mean falling into complete absorption or complete alienation. The crisis came, as crises often do, over something that might seem trivial to outsiders but carried profound symbolic weight. The young men were assigned daily portions from the royal food and wine. This was an honor, a sign that they were being groomed for important positions. To refuse would be an insult to the king, a rejection of his generosity, potentially an act of rebellion. But there was a problem. The royal food violated Jewish dietary laws in multiple ways. It likely included meat from unclean animals. Even if the animals were clean, they would not have been slaughtered according to kosher requirements. The meat might have been offered to idols before being served. The wine could have been used in pagan libations. To eat this food was to participate, even if, passively, in the religious system of Babylon. Here, Daniel faced his first major choice. He could rationalize acceptance. After all, he had already accepted a Babylonian name. He was studying Babylonian literature and learning to interpret omens. Surely eating the king's food was a minor compromise compared to everything else he was doing. Besides, refusing might endanger not just himself but his companions. Was dietary observance really worth the risk? But Daniel understood something crucial. Identity is not maintained through grand gestures alone. It is preserved or lost through daily choices, small acts of faithfulness that accumulate over time. He could study Babylonian wisdom while maintaining intellectual distance. He could answer to his Babylonian name while remembering his Hebrew identity. But eating, the most basic human act, performed 3 times a day, would shape him in ways that study could not. To eat the king's food was to accept absorption. To refuse it was to draw a line that could not be crossed. The genius of his refusal lay in how he framed it. He did not preach about idolatry or condemn Babylonian religion. He did not make it a theological confrontation or a test of wills. Instead, he proposed an experiment. "Allow us to eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days, he suggested to the guardian in charge of them. Then compare our appearance to that of the young men who eat the royal food. Judge by results." This was brilliant strategy. It transformed a religious controversy into a practical test. It gave the guardian a way to permit the request without appearing to endorse rebellion. It focused on outcomes rather than principles, health rather than holiness, and it limited the initial commitment to just 10 days, a period short enough that failure would not be catastrophic. The guardian agreed. For 10 days, Daniel and his friends ate their simple diet of vegetables and water, while the other trainees enjoyed the king's delicacies. And at the Dayflay, the end of the test, they appeared healthier and better nourished than those who had eaten the royal food. Was this a miracle? A supernatural intervention? Or was it simply that a diet of vegetables and water was actually healthier than the rich, heavy food served at the royal court? The text does not say, and perhaps that ambiguity is deliberate. What matters is that faithfulness was rewarded, that the risk of obedience led to vindication, that maintaining identity did not result in disaster, but in blessing. The guardian permitted them to continue their dietary practices. A small victory, but its significance was immense. They had found a way to be in Babylon without being of Babylon, to serve the empire without surrendering their souls, to succeed in a foreign system while maintaining covenant faithfulness. But understand what this meant for their daily experience. Every meal was a reminder of difference, a small act of defiance, a quiet assertion that they belonged to something beyond. Babylon's power to control. While others ate without thinking, Daniel and his friends made conscious choices 3 times a day, choices that reinforced who they were and whose they were. This is the paradox of exile. To survive, you must adapt. To remain yourself, you must resist adaptation. Daniel and his companions had to learn which aspects of Babylonian culture they could embrace and which they must reject. They had to distinguish between what was merely different and what was truly incompatible with faithfulness. They had to develop what we might call a theology of compromise, knowing when to yield and when to stand firm, when to blend in and when to stand out. Their success in the educational program proved that engagement was possible. At the end of 3 years, they were examined by King Nebuchadnezzar himself, alongside all the other young men who had completed training. The king found Daniel and his 3 friends 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. They had not just survived the Babylonian educational system, they had mastered it, excelling beyond those for whom it was native culture. This excellence was not despite their faithfulness, but because of it. By maintaining their identity, by preserving the intellectual and spiritual disciplines of their heritage, they had developed a framework for thinking that gave them advantages the other trainees lacked. The Torah's emphasis on wisdom, on understanding the nature of reality through the lens of divine revelation, had prepared them to evaluate and synthesize the knowledge they acquired in Babylon. They became what we might call resident aliens, present in Babylon but not ultimately of it, contributing to the empire's welfare while maintaining distinct identity, successful in Babylonian terms. While remaining faithful to a covenant, Babylonians neither understood nor honored. It was an existence of perpetual tension, of living between 2 worlds without fully inhabiting either. And yet, in that tension, they discovered something remarkable. The God they served was not diminished by distance from Jerusalem. His sovereignty was not limited by political circumstances. He was with them in Babylon, providing wisdom for their challenges, strength for their choices, vindication for their faithfulness. The exile that seemed to signal God's absence became instead a revelation of his omnipresence. The young men learned to pray toward Jerusalem, maintaining their connection to the city and temple they might never see again. They formed a community of memory, keeping alive the stories, the laws, the hopes that defined them as God's people. They discovered that faith could be portable, that worship did not require the temple, that covenant relationship could be maintained through personal devotion and communal practice even in the heart of paganism. But the tests were far from over. Dietary choices and educational excellence were just the beginning. Ahead lay challenges that would test not just their cleverness or their discipline, but their willingness to face death rather than betray their God. The furnace and the lion's den waited in their future, moments when the tension between faithfulness and survival would become absolutely stark, when no compromise would be possible and no cleverness could bridge the gap. For now, though, they had established themselves. They had proven that it was possible to be both successful and faithful, to serve earthly kings while worshipping the heavenly King, to live in exile without losing their souls. They had become a model for what it meant to be God's people in a world that did not acknowledge God, to maintain identity in a culture designed to erase it, to hope for deliverance while living productively within captivity. Daniel's life had entered a new phase. He was no longer just a son of Jerusalem. He was a servant of the Babylonian court, a resident of the empire's capital, a young man whose gifts had opened doors at the highest levels of power. But he had also become something else, a living demonstration that the God of Israel could not be left behind, that faithfulness could survive transplantation, that even in Babylon there were those who would remember Jerusalem and live as citizens of a kingdom no empire could touch. The world that was Jerusalem had given way to the world that was Babylon. But for Daniel and his companions, a third world had emerged, the world of faith maintained in exile, of identity preserved through resistance, of hope held against all evidence. They lived between 2 worlds, but they belonged ultimately to neither. They belonged to the God who transcended all earthly kingdoms, who would outlast all empires, who would ultimately fulfill all promises. And in that belonging, they found the strength to continue. There is a moment that arrives in every exile's life when the temporary becomes permanent, when you realize that the land is no longer just a place you are passing through, but the place where you will spend your years. For Daniel, that realization came not with despair, but with a kind of determined adaptation. He would live in Babylon, he would serve its kings, but he would do so on his own terms, maintaining an inner compass that pointed always toward Jerusalem and the God who dwelt there. The education he had received in Babylonian wisdom was not wasted. Indeed, it became the foundation for a career that would span more than 6 decades and outlast multiple dynasties. But to understand the full significance of Daniel's success, we must understand what Babylonian education actually entailed, and how radically different it was from the Hebrew wisdom tradition that had shaped his childhood. Babylonian learning was encyclopedic in its scope and intensely practical in its application. The curriculum began with language Akkadian, the lingua franca of the empire, written in the complex cuneiform script that required years to master. Each wedge-shaped character pressed into clay could represent a syllable, a word, or an idea. Literacy was power in Babylon, and only those who could read and write the intricate script could access the accumulated knowledge of centuries. But language was just the beginning. The Chaldean wise men, the intellectual elite of Babylon, studied everything. Mathematics reached levels of sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for over a millennium. The Babylonians understood place value, could solve complex algebraic equations, calculated the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. They divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes divisions we still use today. Astronomy was particularly advanced. Night after night, the Babylonian astrologers recorded the positions of stars and planets, tracking their movements across the sky, compiling data that allowed them to predict eclipses and planetary alignments. This was not idle curiosity. In Babylonian thought, the heavens and earth were intimately connected. What happened above reflected and influenced what happened below. To read the stars was to read the intentions of the gods, to glimpse the future before it arrived. And this is where Babylonian wisdom diverged most sharply from Hebrew wisdom. In Israel, wisdom meant understanding how to live in harmony with God's created order, discerning right from wrong, governing oneself with discipline and justice. The wise man was the one who feared the Lord and kept his commandments. Wisdom was fundamentally moral and relational. In Babylon, wisdom was fundamentally technical and divinatory. The wise man was the one who could interpret omens, who understood the elaborate systems of correspondence between earthly events and cosmic signs. If a certain pattern appeared in the liver of a sacrificed sheep, it predicted military victory. If planets aligned in a particular configuration, it foretold the death of a king. Everything meant something. Nothing happened by chance. The universe was a vast network of signs waiting to be decoded by those with sufficient knowledge. Daniel had to master this system while never believing in its underlying premises. He had to learn to read omens while trusting in a God who was not controlled by omens. He had to study astrology while believing in a creator who transcended the stars. This was no simple feat of intellectual compartmentalization. It required a kind of double vision, an ability to understand how Babylonians thought while maintaining his own distinct framework. The key was recognizing that Babylonian wisdom, for all its errors, was still a form of wisdom. The Babylonians' careful observation of nature, their systematic recording of data, their search for patterns and predictability, these were not entirely misguided. They simply attributed to the stars and omens what actually belonged to the sovereign God who created and sustained all things. The patterns were real. The Babylonians had simply misidentified their source. This allowed Daniel to engage Babylonian learning without compromising his faith. He could appreciate their astronomical precision while rejecting their astrological interpretations. He could study their literature while disagreeing with their theology. He could function within their system while maintaining an inner critique that preserved his Hebrew identity. And then came the moment that would define his career and establish his reputation throughout the empire. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. This was not unusual. Dreams were taken very seriously in the ancient Near East, seen as one of the primary ways the gods communicated with humans. Important dreams required interpretation, and Babylon had an entire class of professionals whose job was to explain what dreams meant. But this dream was different. Nebuchadnezzar woke from it troubled, sensing that it carried profound significance. He summoned his wise men, his magicians and enchanters, his sorcerers and astrologers, all those who claimed the ability to bridge the gap between the human and divine realms. He wanted the dream explained, and then he made an extraordinary demand. He would not tell them the dream. They must tell him both the dream itself and its interpretation. If they could not, they would all be executed. The panic among the wise men was immediate and complete. This was impossible. The standard practice was for the king to recount his dream, and the interpreters would offer explanations, but to demand that they know the dream itself, without being told, no one could do this. Not through all the elaborate techniques they had mastered, not through all the omens they could read, not through all the star charts they had compiled. They protested to the king. What you ask has never been asked of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. It is too difficult. Only the gods could reveal such things, and they do not live among humans. Their protest, ironically, was true. What Nebuchadnezzar demanded was indeed impossible for human wisdom, no matter how sophisticated. He was asking for genuine revelation, not clever interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar was not swayed. "Execute them all," he ordered. Every wise man in Babylon was to be put to death for failing to meet an impossible standard. And because Daniel and his companions had been enrolled among the wise men of Babylon, the death sentence included them as well. Consider the situation. Daniel had done nothing wrong. He had not failed to interpret a dream he had heard. He had not been given the chance to try. Yet he faced execution simply because he belonged to a category of people who had collectively failed an impossible test. This was the brutal logic of autocratic power. Individual justice meant nothing when the king's will was thwarted. But Daniel did not panic. When the commander of the king's guard came to arrest him, Daniel responded with what the text calls wisdom and tact. He asked a simple question: "Why is the king's decree so urgent?" When he learned the reason, he did not protest the injustice or argue about the impossibility of the task. Instead, he made a request. "Give me time, and I will tell the king the interpretation." It was an audacious promise. Daniel had no more natural ability to know Nebuchadnezzar's dream than the Babylonian wise men did. But he knew something they did not. He knew a God who was not distant and unknowable, who did not communicate only through cryptic omens and celestial movements. He knew a God who revealed himself, who spoke to prophets, who could make known what was hidden. Daniel went to his companions Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, still known by their Hebrew names among themselves despite their Babylonian identities. Together, they prayed, not to Marduk or any of Babylon's gods, not through elaborate rituals or magical incantations. They simply asked the God of their fathers to reveal the mystery, to show mercy, to save their lives and the lives of all the wise men of Babylon. That night, in a vision, God revealed the dream and its meaning to Daniel. The relief must have been overwhelming. But more than relief, there was confirmation. Here, in the heart of Babylon, surrounded by astrologers and diviners, magicians and sorcerers, the God of Israel had shown himself more powerful than all of them combined. He had done what they claimed to do but could not. He had revealed what was hidden. Before Daniel went to the king, he praised God. This is important. He did not rush immediately to save himself. He took time to acknowledge the source of his knowledge. "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever," he prayed. "Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him." This prayer contains the heart of Hebrew wisdom. God is sovereign over history. He controls the rise and fall of empires. Human wisdom comes from him. Revelation is possible because God chooses to reveal. Nothing is hidden from him, and he can make known to humans whatever he desires. This was Daniel's framework, the lens through which he interpreted everything he had learned in Babylon. When Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar, he was careful to establish the proper context. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about, Daniel said. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And then he recounted the dream. The king had seen a massive statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Then a rock, cut out but not by human hands, struck the statue on its feet and smashed it to pieces. The fragments were blown away like chaff, and the rock became a mountain that filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar must have been stunned. This was indeed his dream, recounted with perfect accuracy by someone who should have had no way of knowing it. But the interpretation was even more striking. Daniel explained that the statue represented a succession of kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar himself was the head of gold. God had given him sovereignty, power, strength, and glory. But after him would come inferior kingdoms, represented by the lesser metals, and finally, the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed, represented by the rock that shattered the statue. This was an astonishing message to deliver to the most powerful man on earth. Daniel was essentially telling Nebuchadnezzar that his empire, for all its magnificence, was temporary. It would be followed by others, and all would eventually fall before the eternal kingdom of God. Yet he delivered this message without apology or fear, confident that he was speaking truth revealed by the God who controlled all kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar's response was remarkable. He fell prostrate before Daniel and ordered that offerings be made to him. Then he said something that must have startled everyone present. "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery." A pagan king acknowledging the supremacy of Israel's God. It was a moment of breakthrough, a crack in the edifice of Babylonian polytheism. Nebuchadnezzar did not become a monotheist. He would continue to worship his own gods, but he recognized that the God Daniel served possessed power beyond what Babylon's gods had shown. He promoted Daniel to a high position, made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, and placed him in charge of all the wise men. Daniel had succeeded not by abandoning his faith, but by remaining faithful. He had not used Babylonian techniques to solve Nebuchadnezzar's problem. He had prayed to the God of Israel and received genuine revelation, and in doing so, he had demonstrated that Hebrew wisdom, rooted in relationship with the true God, was superior to all the accumulated learning of Babylon. But this triumph created new challenges. Success and power bring their own temptations and dangers. Daniel now occupied a position of enormous influence, yet that influence depended on serving kings whose values and goals often conflicted with his faith. How could he advise policies that served Babylon's interests without betraying his identity as one of the exiled people of Judah? How could he maintain integrity while navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics? The answer lay in the same principles that had guided his earlier choices. He would serve faithfully, use his abilities to benefit those in power, contribute to the welfare of the empire, but he would never compromise on the non-negotiables. He would bow to the king, but not to idols. He would advise on matters of state, but not abandon prayer. He would succeed in Babylon's terms, but never forget whose he ultimately was. Years passed. Daniel's reputation grew. He became not just an interpreter of dreams, but a trusted counselor, someone the king relied upon for wisdom in governing the empire. His 3 companions were also promoted, given authority over the affairs of the province of Babylon. The young exiles had become powerful men, integrated into the machinery of empire at the highest levels. And then came the test that would prove whether their success had cost them their souls. Nebuchadnezzar, impressed by his dream of the statue, and perhaps jealous of its message that his kingdom would not last, decided to create a real statue, one made entirely of gold. He erected it on the plain of Dura, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, a gleaming monument to his power and glory. And he commanded that everyone, when the music played, must fall down and worship it. This was not a request. It was not optional. At the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, every person in the empire must bow and worship the image. Anyone who refused would be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. This was political worship, the use of religion to enforce loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar was asserting that he controlled not just behavior, but belief, not just actions, but allegiance. To bow before his statue was to acknowledge his absolute authority, to participate in the unified identity of the empire, to demonstrate that you belong to Babylon. For most people, this posed no problem. They already worshipped many gods. Adding one more ceremony to their routine cost them nothing. But for Jews, it was impossible. The first commandment given to Moses was absolute. You shall have no other gods before me. The second was equally clear. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we use their Babylonian names because that is how the story has come down to us. Though surely they thought of themselves by their Hebrew names, faced a stark choice. They could bow and preserve their lives, their positions, their ability to do good from within the system, or they could refuse and face certain death. Some of the astrologers, perhaps jealous of these foreigners who had risen so high, came to Nebuchadnezzar to denounce them. There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, they said, who pay no attention to you. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. It was an accusation of disloyalty, of ingratitude, of dangerous difference. These men are not really Babylonian, the accusers implied. They are still Jews, and their refusal to worship the image exposes their true allegiance. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. In rage and anger he summoned the three men. "Is it true?" he demanded, and then he offered them a second chance. "When you hear the music, fall down and worship the image I made. But if you do not worship, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" It was a challenge not just to the three men, but to their God. Nebuchadnezzar was asserting his absolute power, his freedom to do whatever he wished without divine interference. He was saying that in Babylon, his will was the only will that mattered. Even the God who had revealed the dream, who had shown himself to be God of gods and Lord of kings, would not be able to save them if they defied the king. The three men's response has echoed through history as a model of faithful courage. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Consider the profound faith in those words. They affirmed God's power to save them. They expressed confidence that he would save them. But they also acknowledged that he might not, and declared that even if he allowed them to die, they would not compromise. Their faithfulness did not depend on deliverance. They would obey God whether he rescued them or not, whether faithfulness led to reward or to death. This is faith in its purest form, not the faith that expects certain outcomes, that treats God like a vending machine where righteous inputs produce desired outputs, but the faith that obeys regardless of consequences, that chooses faithfulness over survival, that recognizes that some things matter more than life itself. Nebuchadnezzar's fury knew no bounds. He ordered the furnace heated, 7 times hotter than usual. He commanded his strongest soldiers to tie up the 3 men and throw them into the flames. The fire was so hot that it killed the soldiers who threw them in. The 3 men, still bound, fell into the blazing furnace. And then something impossible happened. Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. "Were there not 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked his advisers. "Certainly, your majesty," they replied. "Look," he said, "I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. In the midst of the fire that should have consumed them instantly, the 3 men walked unharmed. Their bonds had burned away, but they remained untouched. And with them walked a 4th figure, a presence that Nebuchadnezzar recognized as divine. God had not prevented the test. He had entered it with them. Nebuchadnezzar approached the furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." The 3 men emerged. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were not scorched. They did not even smell of smoke. The fire had had no power over their bodies. The king's response was immediate and total. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And then Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree. No people of any nation or language may say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for no other god can save in this way. The pagan king had witnessed something that shattered his categories, that proved the existence of a power beyond all he had known. He promoted the 3 men again, giving them still greater authority. But the most important transformation happened in Nebuchadnezzar's own heart. The proud king who had erected a statue to assert his divinity was beginning to learn humility. The process would take years and would require even more dramatic intervention. But seeds had been planted. He had seen that there was a God whose power exceeded his own, whose sovereignty extended into the very furnace he controlled, who could deliver those who trusted him from any fate. For the Jewish exiles watching from a distance, the message was clear. Faithfulness could be costly. The furnace was real. The threat of death was not metaphorical. But God was present even in the fire, able to deliver, worthy of trust even unto death. The question was not whether difficulty would come, but whether they would maintain their identity when it did. Daniel's companions had passed their test. They had proven that success and integration had not eroded their core commitments. They would bow to kings, but not to idols. They would serve empire, but worship only God. And in their faithfulness they had given testimony to the reality and power of the God of Israel in the heart of Babylon itself. The furnace became a symbol for the entire experience of exile. The fire was real, the danger genuine, the suffering not imagined. But God's presence in the fire transformed it from destruction to refining, from death to testimony, from loss to witness. The exiles were being tested, but they were not being abandoned, and in their faithfulness through the fire, they were demonstrating to the watching world that there was a God who deserved absolute allegiance, whose claim on his people transcended all earthly powers. Nebuchadnezzar would learn this lesson again, in an even more personal and devastating way. But for now, the fire had gone out, the furnace was empty, and 3 men walked free, untouched by flames that should have consumed them, living proof that the Most High God was indeed God, and that those who trusted him would never be put to shame. There are moments in history when the spiritual and the political collide with such force that the impact reverberates for centuries. What we are about to witness is one such moment, a night when the profane reached its pinnacle, when human arrogance touched something it should never have touched, and when divine judgment arrived not with armies but with mysterious fingers writing on a wall. But to understand that night, we must first understand what happened to the man who seemed untouchable, the king who had conquered the known world and believed himself beyond the reach of any power, human or divine. Nebuchadnezzar had witnessed miracles. He had seen his wise men fail where Daniel succeeded. He had watched 3 men walk unharmed through flames hot enough to kill soldiers. He had issued decrees acknowledging the God of the Hebrews, yet something in him resisted complete surrender. Pride is perhaps the most stubborn of human failings. It survives evidence. It persists through experience. It rebuilds itself even after devastating defeats. And Nebuchadnezzar's pride was monumental, fitting for a man who ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Another dream came to him, and again only Daniel could interpret it. The king saw an enormous tree that reached to the sky, visible to the ends of the earth. It provided shelter for beasts and birds, food for all living creatures. Then a holy messenger came down from heaven and commanded that the tree be cut down, its branches stripped, its fruit scattered. But the stump was to remain, bound with iron and bronze, left in the grass to be drenched with dew and to live with the animals, while 7 times passed over it. Daniel understood immediately, and was so troubled by the interpretation that he remained silent for a time. "My lord," he finally said, "if only the dream applied to your enemies, and its meaning to your adversaries." But it did not. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar himself. He would be driven away from people and would live with the wild animals until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Daniel urged the king, "Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed." It was a plea for repentance, an offer of mercy before judgment fell. For 12 months, nothing happened. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar thought the danger had passed. Perhaps he convinced himself that the dream was meaningless after all. And then one day, as he walked on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, looking out over the city he had built, pride swelled in his heart. "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence?" he said. "By my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty." Even as the words left his mouth, a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." What followed was a descent into madness so complete that it remains shocking. Even across the millennia, the greatest king on earth was driven from human society. He lived with wild animals, ate grass like cattle, was drenched by dew. His hair grew long like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. For 7 periods, perhaps 7 months, perhaps 7 years, the king who had conquered nations lived as a beast. It was a judgment precisely calibrated to address his sin. He had elevated himself above all others, claiming credit for achievements that were gifts from God. So he was reduced below all others, stripped of everything that made him human, forced to live at the level of creatures who never claim more than they are. But this judgment contained mercy. The stump remained. The tree would grow again, and when the time was complete, something remarkable happened. Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes toward heaven. In that moment of looking up, of acknowledging something above himself, his sanity returned. His reason was restored. And what came from the lips was not anger or resentment, but praise. "I praised the Most High," he declared. "I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' The proud king had become a humble worshipper. The man who claimed to have built Babylon by his mighty power now acknowledged that all power belongs to God alone. Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his throne, but he was a different man. He had learned what prophets and priests had been trying to teach him for years, that human greatness is derivative, that earthly kingdoms rise and fall at divine pleasure, that the only lasting glory belongs to the eternal King. This transformation of Nebuchadnezzar represents one of the most remarkable spiritual journeys recorded in Scripture. A pagan king, an enemy of God's people, the destroyer of Jerusalem and the temple, he ended his days as a worshipper of the Most High God, a man who had learned humility through humiliation, who had found truth through madness, who had discovered God's sovereignty by losing his own. But the lesson did not endure. Empires pass their power to new rulers, but they do not pass wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar died, and after a brief period of instability, his grandson Belshazzar came to power. Actually, Belshazzar was co-regent with his father Nabonidus, who spent much of his time away from Babylon pursuing archaeological and religious interests. This meant Belshazzar functioned as the effective ruler of the empire, holding authority second only to his absent father, and Belshazzar had learned nothing from his grandfather's experience. Or perhaps he knew the stories but did not believe them. Perhaps he thought the tales of dreams and furnaces and madness were exaggerations, the kind of legends that to accumulate around powerful men. Whatever the reason, he walked a path his grandfather had travelled, but without the eventual wisdom that had saved Nebuchadnezzar. The night that sealed his fate began as a celebration. Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. Wine flowed freely. The atmosphere was one of confidence, almost defiance. Outside the city walls, the armies of Cyrus the Persian were laying siege to Babylon, but inside, the leadership feasted. Babylon's walls were impregnable, its supplies could last for years. The city had survived sieges before. There was no reason for fear, but as the wine took effect, as inhibitions fell away, Belshazzar made a decision that crossed a line no previous Babylonian king had crossed. He gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. These were not ordinary vessels. They were sacred objects, created specifically for use in worshipping the God of Israel, consecrated for holy purposes, carried away as plunder when Jerusalem fell. For decades, these vessels had remained in Babylon's treasury, spoils of war but also reminders of a conquered God. Now Belshazzar commanded that they be brought out so he and his nobles, his wives and concubines, could drink from them. And they did not drink to the God of Israel, they drank and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood and stone. Try to comprehend what this meant. These were not just valuable objects. They represented the intersection of the sacred and the profane in the starkest possible terms. When Jerusalem fell, when the temple burned, when these vessels were carried away to Babylon, it seemed that Israel's God had been defeated. The destruction of the temple and the capture of its sacred objects appeared to demonstrate that Marduk was stronger than Yahweh, that Babylon's gods had triumphed over Israel's God. But the exiles knew differently. The prophets had explained that the exile was not proof of God's weakness, but of his judgment on unfaithful Israel. He had not been defeated. He had allowed the temple's destruction as punishment for covenant violations. The sacred vessels in Babylon's treasury were not trophies of divine defeat, but symbols of divine discipline, reminders that God's relationship with his people involved both promise and accountability. Now Belshazzar was using these vessels in a celebration honoring pagan gods. It was not merely disrespectful. It was sacrilege of the highest order, a deliberate profaning of what was holy, an act of cosmic insolence. In ancient Near Eastern understanding, to use another god's sacred objects in worship of your own gods was to claim total victory, to assert that your deities had not just defeated but humiliated the rival god. And as Belshazzar and his guests drank from the temple vessels and praised their worthless idols, gods who could not see or hear or know, gods who existed only in human, Imagination and artistic representation. Something impossible happened. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. Imagine the scene. 1,000 nobles, drunk and celebrating. Music and laughter filling the air. The king holding a golden cup that once held wine for offerings in Jerusalem's temple. And then silence, spreading like a wave across the hall, as people noticed the hand, just the hand, no arm, no body, writing on the wall in the lamplight. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, his legs gave way, his knees knocked together. Terror seized him. Whatever confidence the wine had provided evaporated instantly. This was not a dream that could be explained away. This was not an omen that could be interpreted according to standard techniques. This was direct, divine intervention, unmistakable and terrifying. Belshazzar called for his wise men, the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means," he promised, "will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Third highest because Nabonidus was technically first, Belshazzar second. This was the highest position he could offer. But none of the wise men could read the writing. They could not even identify the script, much less interpret its meaning. The king's terror increased. His nobles were baffled. The celebration had turned into a nightmare. Then the queen, perhaps the queen mother, Nebuchadnezzar's widow, who would have remembered Daniel from years past, entered the hall. "Do not be alarmed," she said to the king. "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your grandfather," she explained, "this man Daniel was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Call for Daniel," she urged, "and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king. By this time, he was an old man, perhaps in his 80s. He had served in the Babylonian court for nearly 70 years. He had outlasted multiple regimes, survived palace intrigues, maintained his faithfulness through decades of exile, and now he stood before a frightened king who had just committed an act of cosmic foolishness. Belshazzar tried to flatter him, recounting his reputation for being able to interpret dreams and solve difficult problems. Then he made his offer. "Read this writing and tell me what it means, and you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." Daniel's response was blunt, stripped of the diplomatic courtesy he usually employed. "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else," he said. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." He was not interested in bribes or positions. He had not spent 7 decades maintaining his integrity only to be bought in the final act. Then Daniel did something remarkable. Before interpreting the writing, he gave a history lesson. He reminded Belshazzar of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, how the Most High God gave him sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty, how pride led to his downfall, how he was driven from human society until he acknowledged God's absolute sovereignty. "But you, Belshazzar, his descendant," Daniel said, "have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and concubines, drank from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. This was more than interpretation. This was judgment. Daniel was explaining not just what the writing meant, but why it had appeared. The cosmic profanity of using Jerusalem's sacred vessels to worship false gods while ignoring the true God had triggered divine response. Belshazzar had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. Then Daniel read the writing. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, 4 words in Aramaic, the common language of the empire, and Daniel explained their meaning. Men, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The message was devastatingly clear. The party was over. The empire that seemed eternal was finished. That very night, judgment would fall. Belshazzar's reign, which had seemed so secure behind Babylon's impregnable walls, would end. The kingdom would pass to others. Everything would change. Belshazzar, perhaps too drunk or too proud or too foolish to fully comprehend what he had just heard, kept his promise. Daniel was clothed in purple, given a gold chain, and proclaimed third highest ruler in the kingdom. It was the most meaningless promotion in history, a title granted mere hours before the kingdom ceased to exist, because that night, while Babylon feasted and celebrated, Cyrus's engineers had accomplished something the city thought impossible. They diverted the Euphrates River, which ran under Babylon's walls. As the water level dropped, Persian soldiers waded through the riverbed and entered the city through gates that had been left open in confidence or carelessness. They moved through the streets, meeting little resistance, heading toward the palace. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. He died in his palace, perhaps still wearing the purple robe and gold chain he had given Daniel. The celebration ended in blood. The empire fell with barely a fight. The writing on the wall had been literally and immediately fulfilled. The Persians found Babylon's wealth intact, its granaries full, its people largely unharmed. It was a conquest achieved through intelligence and engineering rather than destruction. Cyrus would prove to be a very different kind of conqueror than Nebuchadnezzar, with very different policies toward the peoples his empire absorbed. For Daniel and the Jewish exiles, Belshazzar's fall carried profound meaning. The empire that had destroyed Jerusalem, that had carried them into exile, that had seemed so permanent and powerful it had fallen in a single night. The God whom Belshazzar had mocked by profaning the temple vessels had demonstrated his power by bringing down the king who insulted him. The sacred could not be profaned without consequence. The holy would not be mocked. But there was more. The prophets had foretold that exile would last 70 years. That period was nearly complete. Babylon's fall meant more than regime change. It meant the possibility of return, the hope of restoration, the fulfillment of promises made decades earlier when the exiles first stumbled into captivity. The writing on the wall had announced the end of an era. Babylon, the golden kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, had given way to the silver kingdom of the Medes and Persians. History was unfolding according to divine plan. Empires rose and fell on schedule. What seemed permanent proved temporary. What appeared strong revealed itself as fragile, and an old man named Daniel, who had interpreted the writing, stood at the threshold of a new regime, having outlasted the kingdom that had captured him in his youth. His faithfulness had carried him through Babylonian rule. Soon it would be tested under Persian dominion. The exile continued, but its nature was changing. New challenges awaited. New tests of faith approached. But for now, as Persian soldiers secured the city and a new king took inventory of his unexpected conquest, the lesson was clear. There is a God in heaven who judges those who profane what is holy, who brings down the proud, who controls the destiny of empires. The sacred and the profane cannot coexist without confrontation. And when that confrontation comes, it is not the sacred that yields. Belshazzar learned this too late. His grandfather had learned it through madness and recovered through repentance. The difference between them was the difference between tragedy and redemption, between judgment that destroys and judgment that refines. Both men faced the reality of God's sovereignty. One bent and was restored. The other broke and was swept away. The banquet hall fell silent. The wine spilled from fallen cups. The sacred vessels from Jerusalem sat abandoned on tables where they should never have been. And somewhere in the night, the God of Israel, who had allowed his temple to be destroyed, but who, he remained Lord of all, continued to work out his purposes in history, faithful to promises he had made, patient with the people he had chosen, sovereign over every power that imagined itself beyond his reach. There are times when the simplest acts become the most revolutionary, when doing what you have always done becomes an act of defiance, when maintaining your daily routine requires more courage than charging into battle. For Daniel, that time came not in his youth, when he first refused the king's food, but in his old age, when he had become so established, so trusted, so essential to the functioning of empire that it seemed nothing could threaten him. The Persian conquest of Babylon had brought dramatic changes. Cyrus the Great had established policies radically different from those of the Babylonians. Where Nebuchadnezzar had deported conquered peoples and tried to absorb them into Babylonian culture, Cyrus allowed peoples to return to their homelands and practice their grace, religions freely. He saw diversity as a strength rather than a threat. His strategy was to win loyalty through tolerance rather than enforce it through oppression. For the Jewish exiles, this meant something extraordinary. Cyrus issued a decree permitting them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It was the fulfillment of prophecies spoken decades earlier, the answer to prayers offered throughout the long years of captivity. Some of the exiles, perhaps 50,000, made the journey back to Judah. They faced enormous challenges: a ruined city, hostile neighbors, the overwhelming task of rebuilding not just structures but a society. But many exiles stayed in Babylon. Some had been born there and knew no other home. Others had established businesses, built lives, created communities in the diaspora. The permission to return did not mean everyone must return. The Jewish community would now exist in multiple places, connected by shared faith and identity but separated by geography and circumstance. Daniel remained in Babylon. By this time, he was likely in his 80s, far too old for the arduous journey back to Jerusalem. But more than that, he had a role to play. His presence in the imperial court, his wisdom and experience, his reputation for integrity, these were assets for both the empire he served and the people he represented. He could do more good in Babylon than in Jerusalem, so he stayed. Under the new Persian administration, Daniel's gifts were quickly recognized. Darius the Mede, who had been appointed to govern Babylon under Cyrus, organized the kingdom into administrative districts, each overseen by a satrap. Over these satraps, he appointed 3 administrators to whom the satraps would report, ensuring efficiency and preventing corruption. Daniel was one of these 3, and he soon distinguished himself above the others. The text tells us that Daniel had an excellent spirit. He possessed extraordinary qualities, not just intelligence or competence, but character, integrity that could not be bought, judgment that proved reliable, loyalty that transcended political changes. He had served Babylon faithfully. Now he served Persia with the same commitment. And Darius planned to set him over the whole kingdom, to make this elderly Jewish exile the highest official in the empire, second only to the king himself. But excellence creates enemies. Success breeds resentment. And Daniel's impending promotion threatened those who believed the highest positions should go to Persians or Medes, not to a foreigner, not to a remnant of the conquered Babylonian administration, not to someone whose loyalty was suspected of being divided. The other administrators and satraps began looking for grounds to bring charges against Daniel. This is the nature of political intrigue. When you cannot defeat someone on merit, you search for scandal, you manufacture accusations, you find or create weakness to exploit. They examined Daniel's administration of the kingdom, looking for corruption or negligence, anything that could be used to discredit him. They found nothing. No error could be found in Daniel's work. No evidence of corruption, no carelessness in his duties, no favoritism toward his own people, no stealing from the treasury, no abuse of power. After decades of service in positions of tremendous authority, he remained above reproach. The text states it simply but powerfully. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Consider what this means. Daniel had spent his entire adult life navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics, serving under multiple regimes, holding positions where corruption was expected and probably encouraged. Yet he had remained incorruptible. Every decision could be scrutinized. Every action withstood investigation. His integrity was not situational or convenient. It was absolute. Frustrated in their search for the legitimate charges, the conspirators realized they needed a different approach. "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel," they said to one another, "unless it has something to do with the law of his God." They could not attack his work, so they would attack his worship. They would turn his faithfulness into a crime. They came to King Darius with a proposal. All the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, they claimed falsely, have agreed that the king should issue an edict enforcing the following decree. Anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. The king should put this decree in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. It was a clever trap, carefully designed to exploit multiple vulnerabilities. First, it flattered Darius, elevating him temporarily to divine status, suggesting that for 1 month he should be the sole object of worship and petition in his realm. For a king new to power in Babylon, this must have been appealing a way to assert authority, to test loyalty, to demonstrate the unity of his administration. Second, it invoked the famous Persian legal principle of irreversibility. Once a law was signed by the king, not even the king could change it. This was meant to provide legal stability and prevent arbitrary changes, but it also meant that bad laws, once enacted, could not be corrected. The conspirators were betting that they could trick the king into signing something he would later regret but be powerless to undo. Third, and most importantly, the decree was calibrated precisely to ensnare Daniel while appearing reasonable to everyone else. 30 days was not long. Most people could comply without difficulty. Either they prayed to many gods and could include the king in their devotions, or they did not pray regularly and could simply suspend the practice temporarily. But Daniel prayed to one God only, and he prayed regularly, publicly, openly. His devotion was not something he could pause or hide without denying everything he believed. The conspirators knew Daniel's routines. They knew that 3 times daily he went to his upstairs room, opened the windows facing Jerusalem, knelt down, and prayed. This was not secret worship conducted in fear. This was deliberate, visible, consistent faithfulness. Daniel had been doing this for decades, through Babylonian rule and now under Persian administration. It was as much a part of his life as breathing. Why did he pray toward Jerusalem? The city lay in ruins. The temple was destroyed. Yet Jerusalem remained the spiritual center of Jewish identity, the place where God had chosen to put his name, the focal point of covenant promise. To pray toward Jerusalem was to maintain connection with the land, to remember the promises, to orient oneself not toward the empire one served, but toward the God one worshipped. And why 3 times daily? This practice echoed the temple sacrifices morning, afternoon, and evening. Though the temple was gone, the rhythm of worship continued. Prayer replaced sacrifice. Memory sustained presence. The exiles discovered that worship could be portable, that it did not require buildings or priests or offerings, that it could be practiced anywhere by anyone who had a heart turned toward God. When King Darius signed the decree, he sealed Daniel's fate, or so the conspirators believed. The law was now irrevocable. The trap was set. All they had to do was wait for Daniel to do what he had always done, what he would never stop doing, and then they could demand his execution. Daniel learned that the decree had been published. He knew what it meant. He understood the danger perfectly. This was not a misunderstanding he could clarify or a problem he could solve through clever diplomacy. This was a direct conflict between two absolute claims: the king's temporary demand for exclusive worship and God's eternal right to exclusive worship. There could be no compromise. He had three choices. He could stop praying for 30 days, suspend the practice temporarily, resume it later, survive the trap. He could pray in secret, close his windows, whisper his prayers, maintain his devotion while avoiding detection. Or he could continue exactly as before, openly, visibly, knowingly violating the decree and accepting the consequences. Some might argue that the first two options were reasonable. God surely understood the situation. Surely temporary cessation of public prayer, or a shift to private prayer, would not constitute unfaithfulness. Surely wisdom dictated survival. Daniel was valuable to his people. His death would serve no purpose. Wasn't discretion the better part of valor? But Daniel had spent 70 years learning that faithfulness was not negotiable, that some compromises, however reasonable they appeared, crossed lines that could not be crossed. He had maintained his identity through dietary choices when he was young. He had witnessed his friends choose the furnace over the idol. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall according to divine plan. And he had learned that faithfulness must be consistent, must be visible, must be maintained, even at the cost of life itself. So, when Daniel learned of the decree, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. The text emphasizes this. Just as he had done before, nothing changed. The new law did not alter his behavior. The threat of death did not modify his practice. He continued exactly as always. This was prayer as resistance, not rebellion against legitimate authority. Daniel had served the Persian Empire faithfully in everything proper to his position. But when political authority demanded what belonged to God alone, when the law commanded what conscience forbade, resistance became not just permissible but necessary. And Daniel's resistance took the form of simply continuing to do what he had always done, refusing to allow political pressure to compromise spiritual faithfulness. The conspirators were watching. They came as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. They had their evidence. They went immediately to the king and reminded him of the decree. "Did you not publish a decree," they asked, "that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they sprang their trap. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Notice how they framed the accusation. They emphasized that Daniel was an exile, a foreigner, implying that his loyalty was questionable. They suggested he showed disrespect to the king personally. They made it sound like rebellion rather than faithfulness to conscience. The king was distressed. The text says he was greatly distressed and made every effort to rescue Daniel, working until sundown to find a way to save him. Darius had been manipulated. He had signed a decree without understanding its true purpose, and now he was trapped by his own law. He could not simply pardon Daniel. Persian law did not permit it. The irreversibility that was meant to provide legal stability now prevented justice. But the conspirators gave him no room to maneuver. They came as a group and said to the king, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." They were insisting on execution, pressing their advantage, ensuring that the king could not find an escape. So, the king gave the order. Daniel was brought and thrown into the lion's den. But even in giving the order, Darius expressed his hope and his faith. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." It was a remarkable statement. The king, who had been tricked into signing a decree, making himself the sole object of worship, was now expressing faith in Daniel's God to save Daniel from the consequence of the king's own law. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation could not be changed. Everything was official, legal, irreversible. Daniel was entombed with the lions. By all human calculation, he would be dead within minutes. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating. He refused entertainment. He could not sleep. At the first light of dawn he got up and hurried to the lion's den. He called out in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And a voice answered from the den, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Daniel had survived the night. Not through any natural means. Lions in ancient royal dens were kept deliberately hungry to ensure they would kill anyone thrown to them. This was not a matter of tame or well-fed animals. These were predators that should have torn Daniel apart the moment he entered their den. Instead, something had stopped them. An angel, Daniel said, had shut their mouths. The king was overjoyed. He gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den, and when Daniel was brought up, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The parallel to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace is striking. Once again, faithfulness had led to a death sentence. Once again, God had delivered his servant. Once again, the instruments of execution had been rendered powerless. But the story did not end there. The king's joy turned to anger against those who had manipulated him. He gave orders to bring the men who had falsely accused Daniel, and they were thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. The same lions that had not touched Daniel destroyed his accusers instantly. Then Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages throughout the land, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." The pagan king had become an evangelist for the God of Israel. The attempt to destroy Daniel's influence had instead resulted in a decree proclaiming God's sovereignty throughout the Persian Empire. What was meant for evil, God had used for good. What was intended to silence witness had amplified it. The conspirators' plot had backfired spectacularly. For the Jewish community in exile, Daniel's deliverance carried profound meaning. They lived as minorities in a hostile or indifferent world. They faced constant pressure to assimilate, to abandon distinctive practices, to blend in for the sake of survival and success. Daniel's example showed them that faithfulness was possible, that maintaining identity did not necessarily lead to destruction, that God could deliver those who trusted him. But the example also contained an implicit warning. Deliverance was not guaranteed. The three friends had told Nebuchadnezzar that even if God did not save them from the furnace, they would not worship the idol. Their faithfulness was not conditional on deliverance. Daniel's prayer routine did not depend on believing he would survive the lions. Faithfulness was its own reward, its own justification. Survival was grace, not entitlement. Daniel's life had become a testimony to the possibility of maintaining faith in exile. He had shown that it was possible to serve earthly kingdoms without betraying the heavenly king, to succeed in imperial systems without surrendering spiritual identity, to rise to the highest positions without compromising core convictions. But his example also made clear that such faithfulness came with costs and risks. The furnace was real. The lion's den was real. The threats were not metaphorical. Prayer, in Daniel's life, was the daily act that maintained everything else. It was the discipline that kept him connected to God, oriented toward Jerusalem, mindful of his identity. It was not escapism or mysticism detached from reality. It was the most practical thing he did, the foundation that made all his other work possible. When prayer was threatened, when the choice became pray or survive, Daniel chose prayer because without it survival would have been meaningless, and he had learned something that would sustain the Jewish people through centuries of diaspora existence. You can take away the land, you can destroy the temple, you can exile the people, but you cannot stop them from praying. You cannot prevent them from maintaining covenant relationship through devotion. You cannot erase identity that is sustained by daily acts of faithfulness. The lion's den, like the furnace, became a symbol for the entire exile experience. The danger was real, the threat genuine, the suffering not imagined. But God's presence in the danger transformed it. Daniel survived not because the lions were not hungry, but because God shut their mouths. The exiles would survive not because exile was easy, but because God was with them in it. Daniel was old now. He had lived. Through the entire 70 years of exile, he had seen Jerusalem fall and Babylon rise. He had watched Babylon fall and Persia ascend. He had served kings and survived plots. He had maintained faithfulness through every challenge. And he had one more role to play, not as administrator or counselor, but as prophet and visionary, someone who would see beyond the immediate circumstances into the deeper patterns of history and God's ultimate purposes. But that was yet to come. For now, an old man climbed out of a den of lions, unharmed and vindicated, living proof that some things matter more than life itself, and that the God who commands absolute loyalty is worthy of the trust he requires. There comes a moment in some lives when the ordinary world becomes transparent, when the veil between present and future seems to thin, when vision penetrates beyond what can be seen with physical eyes. For Daniel, these moments came in dreams and visions, experiences so vivid and disturbing that they left him exhausted, bewildered, seeking meaning in symbols that seemed to exceed human understanding. These were not the dreams of kings that Daniel had interpreted. These were his own visions, revelations given to him directly, apocalyptic literature emerging in response to the crisis of exile. And to understand what Daniel saw, we must first understand what apocalyptic literature actually is, and why it appears during periods of persecution and powerlessness. The word apocalypse means unveiling, or revelation. Apocalyptic literature claims to pull back the curtain on reality, to reveal the hidden dimensions of history, to show that what appears chaotic and meaningless is actually following a divine script. It emerges when God's people face overwhelming oppression, when earthly powers seem invincible, when faithfulness appears futile. In such moments, apocalyptic visions offer hope by revealing that history has a trajectory, that evil empires will fall, that God's kingdom will ultimately triumph. But apocalyptic literature is strange to modern readers. It traffics in symbols and metaphors, in beasts with multiple heads and horns, in cosmic battles and divine interventions. It speaks in code, partly because it was often written under persecution and needed to communicate hope to believers while remaining opaque to oppressors. A beast with 10 horns might mean nothing to a Roman or Greek official, but to Jews familiar with prophetic imagery, it could represent specific kingdoms or rulers. Daniel's visions came to him in the latter years of Babylonian rule and the early years of Persian dominance. He was an old man by this time, having spent most of his life in exile, and now, having served so long in positions of political power, having witnessed the rise and fall of empires from the inside, he was granted visions that placed these historical changes in cosmic context. The first vision came in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. Daniel saw 4 great beasts coming up out of the sea, each different from the others. The sea in ancient Near Eastern thought often represented chaos, the primordial forces of disorder that threatened creation. That these beasts emerged from the sea suggested they were manifestations of chaos, powers opposed to God's ordered purpose. The first beast was like a lion with eagle's wings. As Daniel watched, the wings were torn off, and it was made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Most interpreters see this as representing Babylon, with the transformation perhaps alluding to Nebuchadnezzar's period of madness and subsequent restoration. The second beast looked like a bear, raised up on one of its sides, with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told to devour many people. This likely represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which would conquer and absorb multiple kingdoms. Then came a third beast, like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. It was given authority to rule. Many see this as representing the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, who conquered with remarkable speed, hence the wings, and whose empire divided into 4 parts after his death, hence the 4 heads. But the 4th beast was different from all the others. It was terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It had 10 horns. This beast, most scholars believe, represented Rome, though Daniel lived centuries before Rome's rise. The vision was not just describing Daniel's present, but seeing far into the future. As Daniel watched this 4th beast, he saw a little horn emerge among the 10, displacing 3 of the earlier horns. This horn had eyes like human eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. It represented a specific ruler, a manifestation of arrogant power that would speak against God and persecute his people. And then the vision shifted to heaven. Daniel saw thrones set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool, his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. This image of God as the Ancient of Days, eternal, pure, judging from a throne that blazes with fire, stands in stark contrast to the earthly empires represented by the beasts. The beasts are monstrous, chaotic, emerging from the sea. God is ancient, ordered, enthroned in majesty. The beasts devour and destroy. God judges righteously. The vision establishes that despite appearances, despite the apparent power of earthly kingdoms, the ultimate authority belongs to the Ancient of Days. Daniel watched as the boastful horn continued speaking. Then the 4th beast was slain and its body destroyed, and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. The message was clear. All earthly empires would fall. Some would be destroyed completely, others would decline and fade, but none would last. And then Daniel saw something that would echo through Jewish and Christian theology for millennia. In his vision, he saw one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This figure, the Son of Man, was clearly distinct from the beasts. They emerged from the sea, from chaos. He came with the clouds of heaven from the realm of God. They were bestial, representing the brutal and dehumanizing nature of earthly empires. He was like a son of man, fully human, representing the restoration of true humanity. They received temporary authority that would be taken away. He received eternal dominion that would never end. For Jews reading this vision in later centuries, particularly during periods of persecution, the Son of Man represented the hope of a future deliverer, a Messiah who would establish God's eternal kingdom. For Christians, this figure was identified with Jesus, whose claims to divine authority and eternal kingship echoed Daniel's vision. But in its original context, the vision functioned as a philosophy of history, a way of making sense of the rise and fall of empires. Daniel was troubled by the vision. He approached one of those standing there and asked the meaning. The interpretation was given. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. This was the heart of the message. Empires would come and go. Babylon would fall to Persia. Persia would fall to Greece. Greece would fall to Rome. But ultimately, the kingdom would be given to the holy people of God. History was not meaningless chaos. It was unfolding according to divine plan. The faithful who suffered under earthly empires could trust that their suffering had purpose and that their vindication was certain. But Daniel wanted more detail about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying. He was told that this beast would be a 4th kingdom that would devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns were 10 kings who would come from this kingdom. After them, another king would arise who would be different from the earlier ones. He would subdue 3 kings. He would speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people, trying to change the set times and the laws. The holy people would be delivered into his hands. For a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years, a period representing a limited duration of persecution. But then the court would sit in judgment, and his power would be taken away and completely destroyed forever. The sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven would be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers would worship and obey him. Daniel was deeply troubled by what he saw. The vision left him pale-faced, and he kept the matter to himself. This is an important detail. Apocalyptic visions were not meant to be immediately clear. They required reflection, interpretation, pondering. They revealed patterns without always specifying details. They gave hope without removing mystery. Later, during the reign of Belshazzar, Daniel received another vision, this time more specific in its symbolism. He saw a ram with 2 horns standing beside a canal. One horn was longer than the other, but grew up later. The ram charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and it did as it pleased, and became great. Then a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It charged at the ram in great rage and struck it, shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. This vision was less cryptic than the first. The angel Gabriel, whose appearance in Daniel represents one of the first explicit mentions of angels by name in Scripture, came to interpret it. The two-horned ram represented the kings of Media and Persia. The goat represented the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes was the first king. The four horns that replaced the one represented four kingdoms that would emerge from his nation, but would not have the same power. This was remarkably specific prophecy. Daniel, living under Persian rule, was being shown that Greece would conquer Persia. The vision anticipated Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire, his sudden death at the height of his power, and the division of his empire among his generals. Written during Persian times, the vision claimed to see through centuries to events that had not yet occurred. But the vision went further. Out of one of the four horns came another horn, which started small but grew in power toward the south and the east, and toward the beautiful land, a clear reference to the land of Israel. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. This portion of the vision pointed to a specific crisis that would come to the Jewish people: the desecration of the temple, the cessation of worship, persecution of believers. For Jews living centuries after Daniel, this was understood to refer to Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek ruler who in the 2nd century before the Common Era would indeed desecrate the Jerusalem temple, forbid Jewish worship, and persecute those who remained faithful to the law. The vision showed that this persecution would last for 2,300 evenings and mornings, after which the sanctuary would be reconsecrated. This corresponded roughly to the period of Antiochus's persecution and the subsequent Maccabean revolt that restored temple worship. Again, the vision was offering hope to those who would face persecution. Your suffering has a limit. Your deliverance has a date. Hold on. Daniel was overwhelmed by this vision. He lay exhausted for several days and was ill. When he finally got up and returned to his work serving the king, he was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. The weight of seeing future suffering for his people, even suffering that would come long after his death, was crushing. But he was not finished receiving visions. In the 1st year of Darius the Mede, Daniel was studying the book of Jeremiah and understood from the scriptures that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. The exile was nearly over. The time of return was approaching. And so, Daniel turned to God in prayer and petition, in fasting, in sackcloth and ashes. His prayer is one of the most profound confessions in Scripture. He acknowledged Israel's sins, confessed that they had not obeyed the Lord or kept the laws he had given them through his servants the prophets. He admitted that the disaster that had come upon Jerusalem, the greatest disaster ever to occur under heaven, was deserved, the consequence of unfaithfulness. But he appealed to God's mercy, asking him to turn away his anger and his wrath from Jerusalem, to forgive, to restore, not because the people deserved it, but for his own sake, because Jerusalem was his city and his people bore his name. While Daniel was still praying, Gabriel appeared again, the same angel who had interpreted his earlier vision. Gabriel had been sent in response to Daniel's prayer, and he came with a message about the future, about God's purposes for the Jewish people and for Jerusalem. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, Gabriel said. This cryptic phrase, 77s, or 70 weeks, has been interpreted in multiple ways throughout history. Some see it as 70 weeks of years, 490 years, a symbolic period representing the time from exile to restoration. Others see it as a more complex prophetic timeline pointing toward the coming of a Messiah. Gabriel explained that during this period, specific things would be accomplished: finishing, transgression, putting an end to sin, atoning for wickedness, bringing in everlasting righteousness, sealing up vision and prophecy, and anointing the most holy place. These were comprehensive spiritual goals, a complete restoration not just of temple and city but of relationship between God and people. The timeline was broken into periods. After 7 sevens and 62 sevens, after 483 years, an anointed one, a ruler, would come. Jerusalem would be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one would be put to death and would have nothing. The people of the ruler who would come would destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end would come like a flood, bringing war and desolations. For 1/7, the final week, a covenant would be confirmed with many, but in the middle of that 7, sacrifice and offering would be ended, and an abomination that causes desolation would be set up. This prophecy has been debated and interpreted for over 2,000 years. Some see it as predicting the coming of Jesus as Messiah, his death, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in 70 CE, and the desecration of the temple. Others see it as referring to events in the Maccabean period, or as having multiple fulfillments. The very ambiguity of apocalyptic literature means it can speak to multiple situations, offering hope to communities facing persecution in different eras. What is clear is that Daniel was being shown that history was not random, that God had purposes that would unfold over centuries, that the exile would end but challenges would continue, that restoration would come but would not be the end of the story. The people would need sustained faithfulness not just for Daniel's generation but for generations to come. In later visions, Daniel saw even more disturbing images. Wars between kings of the north and south, conflicts that would sweep across the land of Israel, persecution and apostasy, suffering and faithfulness. But always the visions ended with the same promise. Deliverance would come, God's purposes would triumph, the faithful would be vindicated. One vision concluded with perhaps the most significant theological development in the Old Testament. Daniel was told, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars for ever and ever." This was one of the clearest expressions of resurrection hope in Hebrew Scripture. Previously, the afterlife had been shadowy and uncertain, but here was a promise of resurrection, of judgment, of eternal destinies determined by faithfulness or unfaithfulness. Those who suffered for their faith would not lose in the end. Death was not the final word. Righteousness would ultimately be rewarded, wickedness ultimately punished. Daniel. He was told to seal up the vision and the scroll until the time of the end. Many would go here and there to increase knowledge. The visions were not just for his generation. They would be preserved, studied, pondered by future generations facing their own crises, finding their own meanings in the symbolic language. For communities in exile, for believers facing persecution, for people overwhelmed by the power of empires that seemed eternal, Daniel's visions offered something precious, a way of seeing through time to the patterns beneath history's surface. Empires rose and fell according to divine schedule. Persecution was real but temporary. Faithfulness mattered even when it seemed futile. The kingdom that mattered most was not the one with the most powerful army, but the one that would never end. Daniel's apocalyptic visions gave birth to a genre of literature that would sustain Jewish and later Christian communities through centuries of oppression. The Book of Revelation, in the New Testament, draws heavily on Daniel's imagery. Jewish apocalyptic literature flourished during the Roman period, offering hope to those who suffered under imperial domination. The symbols and patterns Daniel saw would be adapted and reinterpreted by community after community, each finding in the visions a framework for understanding their own suffering and maintaining hope. But for Daniel himself, the visions were exhausting and troubling. He did not receive clear answers to all his questions. He was shown patterns without complete explanations. He saw suffering that would come centuries after his death. The gift of seeing through time was also a burden, a weight of knowledge about future pain. Yet he remained faithful. He continued to pray, to serve, to live with integrity. He did not become so focused on future apocalyptic events that he neglected present responsibilities. He maintained the daily disciplines that had sustained him throughout his life. He lived in the tension between apocalyptic vision and ordinary faithfulness, between seeing empires as temporary beasts and serving those empires with excellence. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Daniel's visions. Apocalyptic hope does not mean withdrawal from the world. It means engagement with the world while maintaining perspective on what truly matters and what will ultimately endure. It means working for justice and serving others, while knowing that human kingdoms are temporary and only God's kingdom is eternal. It means living in the present with one eye on the future, faithful in small things while trusting God with large things. Daniel had seen through time. He had been given glimpses of centuries yet to unfold, of empires yet to rise and fall, of suffering yet to come, and deliverance yet to arrive. And having seen these things, he returned to his daily life praying 3 times a day, serving the Persian administration, maintaining his identity as a faithful son of Judah in the heart of empire. The visions did not give him escape. They gave him hope. They did not remove him from history. They helped him understand history's trajectory. They did not make his life easier. They made it more meaningful, and in making it meaningful, they sustained him to the end. Every life tells a story, but some lives tell a story larger than themselves. They become templates, models, parables that speak across centuries to people facing similar challenges in different circumstances. Daniel's life became such a story, not just a record of one man's faithfulness, but a pattern for how to live when the world you knew has ended, and the world you hoped for has not yet arrived. Consider what Daniel accomplished simply by remaining himself. He spent 70 years in exile, the entire biblical span predicted by Jeremiah. He served under at least 4 different kings: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. He witnessed the fall of the empire that had captured him and the rise of the empire that would eventually permit return. He held positions of extraordinary power and influence, becoming indispensable to rulers who knew nothing of his God and cared nothing for his people. Yet through it all, he remained recognizably Jewish. His Babylonian name never erased his Hebrew identity. His education in Chaldean wisdom never replaced his formation in Torah. His success in imperial administration never compromised his ethical standards. His integration into pagan society never meant assimilation into pagan values. He proved that it was possible to be simultaneously in Babylon and of Jerusalem, to serve earthly kings while worshipping the heavenly king, to excel in a foreign system while maintaining distinct identity. This was no small achievement. The pressures toward assimilation were enormous and constant. Every day presented choices between fitting in and standing out, between advancing one's career and maintaining one's conscience, between the path of least resistance and the narrow way of faithfulness. Daniel navigated these choices with remarkable consistency, finding the balance between necessary adaptation and non-negotiable conviction. His strategy, if we can call it that, rested on a few key principles. First, he engaged culture without surrendering to it. He learned Babylonian language and literature, but evaluated everything through the lens of Hebrew faith. He mastered the empire's intellectual traditions, but maintained his own theological framework. He became bilingual in worldview, capable of functioning in Babylonian categories while thinking in Jewish terms. Second, he chose his battles carefully. He accepted his Babylonian name but continued praying as a Jew. He studied divination but relied on revelation. He served in the imperial bureaucracy but refused to worship imperial gods. He knew which compromises were merely pragmatic and which crossed lines that could not be crossed. He distinguished between what was culturally different and what was spiritually incompatible. Third, he maintained daily disciplines regardless of circumstances. 3 times a day, every day, for 70 years, he prayed toward Jerusalem. This was not just private devotion. It was identity maintenance, memory preservation, hope sustained through practice. When everything else changed, when empires fell and new rulers arose, when colleagues came and went, when policies shifted, prayer remained constant. It was the thread of continuity through decades of disruption. Fourth, he served the common good even when serving his enemies. Daniel worked for the welfare of Babylon and later Persia. He used his abilities to benefit empires that had conquered his homeland. This was not collaboration or betrayal. It was the recognition that faithfulness to God included being useful to others, even others who did not acknowledge God. It was living out the command the prophet Jeremiah had given to the exiles: "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." And fifth, he never forgot who he was or whose he was. No amount of success, no degree of integration, no level of acceptance by Babylonian or Persian society changed his fundamental identity. He was Daniel, son of Judah, servant of the Most High God, keeper of the covenant, one who remembered Jerusalem and longed for restoration even while living productively in exile. This example became foundational for Jewish diaspora existence. After the Babylonian exile ended, many Jews never returned to the land. They remained scattered across the Persian Empire and later the Greek and Roman worlds. They faced the same challenges Daniel had faced. How do we maintain identity in a foreign culture? How do we practice our faith without a temple? How do we pass our values to the next generation when surrounded by different values? The answer, in large part, came from the pattern Daniel established. The synagogue emerged as a portable version of temple worship, prayer instead of sacrifice, Torah study instead of ritual, community gathering instead of pilgrimage. Jews could gather in any city, in any land, to pray toward Jerusalem, to study scripture, to maintain covenant identity. The temple was in Jerusalem, but Judaism could be practiced anywhere. Dietary laws, Sabbath observance, and other distinctive practices became boundary markers that preserved Jewish identity across geography and through time. These were not arbitrary rules. They were daily reminders of difference, regular occasions to choose covenant faithfulness over convenience, constant reinforcements of belonging to a people set apart. Every meal, every week, Jews faced the same choices Daniel had faced to maintain distinctiveness or to blend in, and every choice reinforced or eroded identity. The book of Daniel itself became part of this preservation strategy. It was read, copied, studied, taught to each generation. The stories of faithfulness, the dietary resistance, the fiery furnace, the lion's den became teaching tools for children and adults alike. They showed that faithfulness was possible, that God could deliver, that maintaining identity mattered more than avoiding difficulty. The visions in the book functioned differently but equally importantly. They gave a framework for understanding persecution and suffering. When later generations of Jews faced oppression under Greek or Roman rule, Daniel's apocalyptic visions helped them make sense of their experience. The beasts represented empires. The suffering was temporary. The kingdom of God would ultimately triumph. History had a trajectory, and faithfulness would be vindicated. This influence extended beyond Judaism. When Christianity emerged, born from Jewish roots, it inherited and adapted Daniel's template for diaspora existence. Early Christians, scattered across the Roman Empire, facing persecution and pressure to assimilate, found in Daniel's example a model for their own situation. They too were exiles, aliens and strangers in the world, citizens of a kingdom not yet fully realized. They too had to determine how to live faithfully in hostile or indifferent societies. The Book of Revelation, written to Christians facing persecution under Rome, drew heavily on Daniel's imagery. The beasts, the horns, the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man, all reappeared, adapted to new circumstances, but carrying the same essential message. Earthly empires are temporary. God's kingdom is eternal. Faithfulness matters even unto death. Vindication will come. Daniel's influence on apocalyptic thinking shaped both Jewish and Christian movements for centuries. Groups facing persecution found hope in apocalyptic literature. The patterns Daniel saw: empires rising and falling, persecution followed by deliverance, the triumph of God's kingdom, were applied again and again to new situations. The Maccabees fighting Antiochus, Jews resisting Rome, Christians facing imperial persecution, medieval movements expecting divine intervention, all drew on apocalyptic frameworks rooted in Daniel's visions. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was not the apocalyptic visions, but the daily faithfulness. Daniel showed that righteousness was not about spectacular acts of heroism, but about consistent choices made day after day, year after year, decade after decade. It was about maintaining prayer when prayer was costly. It was about integrity in administration when corruption was expected. It was about serving well without serving idols. It was about living with excellence without compromising convictions. This kind of faithfulness is harder than martyrdom in some ways. Martyrdom is one intense moment. Daily faithfulness is a lifetime of moments, each requiring the same choice, each presenting the same temptations. To pray 3 times daily for 70 years requires more cumulative courage than one dramatic act of defiance. To maintain ethical standards through decades of opportunity for corruption requires more sustained character than one heroic sacrifice. Daniel's question, the question his life both posed and answered, was fundamentally this: how do we remain ourselves in someone else's world? How do we maintain identity when everything around us tells us to change? How do we live faithfully when faithfulness seems to disadvantage us and compromise seems prudent? His answer was not withdrawal into isolated communities. He did not create a Jewish ghetto in Babylon or refuse to engage with pagan culture. His answer was strategic engagement, full participation in society's practical affairs, combined with non-negotiable boundaries around core convictions. Work in the empire, but worship only God. Learn the culture, but maintain distinct identity. Serve the common good, but never at the cost of conscience. This balance is difficult. It requires constant discernment, ongoing evaluation, of which compromises are acceptable and which are not. It demands both confidence in one's convictions and humility about one's judgments. It needs both strength to resist pressure and wisdom to recognize when resistance is unnecessary. Daniel maintained this balance for 7 decades, which suggests it was not just personality or circumstance, but the fruit of daily practice, of choosing faithfulness, one decision at a time, until faithful choosing became habitual. And perhaps most importantly, Daniel demonstrated that faithfulness in exile required hope, not naive optimism that ignored reality, but sturdy hope rooted in promises, sustained by memory, nourished by vision. He prayed toward Jerusalem, even when Jerusalem lay in ruins. He maintained Jewish practices even when the temple was gone. He held to covenant identity even when covenant blessings seemed absent. He lived between memory of what had been and promise of what would be, between the world that was Jerusalem and the world that would be God's eternal kingdom. This living between memory and promise, between present duty and future hope, between engagement and distinctiveness, became the defining characteristic of faithful diaspora existence. It meant taking current responsibilities seriously, while not mistaking current circumstances for ultimate reality. It meant working for proximate goods while longing for ultimate good. It meant living fully in the present while knowing the present was not the whole story. Consider the profound faith required for this posture. Daniel spent his entire adult life in exile. He never saw Jerusalem rebuilt. He never worshipped in a restored temple. He never witnessed the fulfillment of the promises he held so tightly. Yet he lived as if those promises were certain, as if faithfulness mattered even when rewards were not visible, as if God's kingdom was real even when earthly kingdoms seemed to be the only reality that counted. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Daniel's life. Faithfulness does not depend on seeing outcomes. It is not a transaction where righteous behavior guarantees favorable results. It is commitment to covenant relationship regardless of circumstances. Obedience to God, whether He delivers or not. Maintenance of identity, whether return comes or not. Prayer toward Jerusalem, whether Jerusalem stands or lies in ruins. Daniel died in Persia. The text does not record his death, but we know he never returned to Judah. He lived his entire adult life away from the land of promise, away from the city he prayed toward, away from the temple that symbolized God's presence. Yet he died faithful, having lived a life that showed that exile could not separate God's people from God, that deportation could not destroy covenant relationship, that the kingdom of God could exist even in the heart of Babylon. His life became a story that sustained his people through centuries of scattering. When Jews found themselves in Alexandria or Rome or Abraham, 1,000 other cities, they remembered Daniel. When Christians faced persecution or the challenge of living as minorities in hostile cultures, they looked to Daniel's example. When any community of faith struggled with the tension between faithfulness and survival, between maintaining identity and adapting to circumstances, Daniel's life offered both challenge and encouragement. The challenge: do not compromise the non-negotiables. The encouragement: God is with his people even in exile. The challenge: maintain daily faithfulness over decades. The encouragement: faithfulness matters even when outcomes are not visible. The challenge: live in the world without being of the world. The encouragement: can be done. Daniel did it. And so Daniel's life echoes forward through time, speaking to every generation that finds itself living between memory and promise, between what was and what will be, between present difficulty and future hope. His example says, hold on, be faithful, pray even when prayer seems futile. Maintain integrity even when corruption is expected. Serve others even when serving your enemies. Remember who you are even when everything tells you to forget. Hope even when hope seems absurd. Because in the end, as Daniel learned, and as his life proclaimed, faithfulness is its own reward. Identity is worth preserving. Hope is worth maintaining. And the God who calls his people to these things is worthy of absolute trust. Empires rise and fall. Circumstances change. Exile ends and new challenges begin. But covenant faithfulness, identity rooted in God's promises, hope, sustained by memory and vision, these endure. Daniel lived between two worlds but belonged ultimately to a third, the kingdom that would outlast all earthly kingdoms, the reign that would never end, the reality that was more real than all the temporary powers he served. And in that belonging, he found the strength to live faithfully for 70 years in a land that was not his own, serving kings who did not know his God, maintaining hope for a return he never saw, preserving identity for a future he would not experience, but his people would inherit. This was Daniel's gift to the ages, the pattern for how to live between memory and promise, the template for faithfulness in exile, the proof that identity can be maintained across generations and continents, the demonstration that the kingdom of God exists wherever his people choose faithfulness over compromise, prayer over assimilation, hope over despair. His story continues to speak because the questions it addresses remain urgent. How do we live faithfully in cultures that do not share our values? How do we maintain identity when pressures toward conformity are intense? How do we hope for what we cannot see while living responsibly in what we can see? How do we remain ourselves in someone else's world? Daniel's answer lived across 7 decades in the heart of empire, through daily prayer that connects us to our true home, through consistent choices that reinforce identity, through service that contributes to the common good, through hope that sustains when circumstances discourage, through faithfulness that perseveres, whether God delivers dramatically or sustains quietly or allows suffering for purposes we cannot fully see. The exile ended. Daniel's life ended. But the pattern he established, the template he provided, the example he lived, these continue. And wherever God's people find themselves living between memory and promise, between the world that was and the world that will be, Daniel's life continues to offer both challenge and hope, both demand and encouragement, both question and answer. How do we remain faithful in exile? We remember Daniel. We pray as he prayed. We choose as he chose. We hope as he hoped. We serve as he served. And we trust that the God who sustained him through 70 years in Babylon will sustain us through whatever exiles we face, until the day when exile ends, and all God's promises are fulfilled, and we finally see the kingdom for which we prayed and toward which we lived. This is Daniel's legacy. Faithfulness is possible. Identity can be preserved. Hope endures. And the kingdom that matters most is not the one with the greatest power, but the one that will never end.